My name is Shandonga, and the day I woke to the sound of rain pattering on our cracked roof was the day I realized I had been given a second chance. My little sister's wet cough echoed through the stillness of our small home, and with each ragged breath she took, memories of a past life crashed through my mind like a flood I couldn't stop. I remembered failing them before, watching my family star while I stood powerless, and the weight of that regret pressed against my chest like a stone. I gripped the edge of my thin blanket, the rough fabric scratching against my calloused fingers as I forced myself to sit up. The damp air clung to my skin, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold morning light that leaked through the gaps in our wooden walls. My sister lay curled on her mat in the corner, her small body shaking with each cough that tore from her throat. This time will be different. I swung my legs off the sleeping mat and planted my bare feet on the cold dirt floor, feeling the moisture seep between my toes. The hunger gnawing in my own stomach was nothing compared to the determination burning in my chest, a fire that had been rekindled from whatever force had sent me back to this moment. I moved quickly across the room, my eyes scanning the shadowy corners until I found what I needed. My father's old tools hung on rusted nails driven into the wall. A leather slingshot with a cracked pouch and a hunting knife so worn that the blade had turned dull and brown with age. I grabbed both, testing the weight of the knife in my palm before tucking it into the frayed rope that served as my belt. "Brother?" My sister's voice was barely a whisper, weak and scratchy from her coughing. "I'm going to bring food," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart hammered against my ribs. "Stay warm," she nodded, pulling her own thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, and I turned away before the sight of her sunken cheeks could make me hesitate. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping out into the gray morning where rain drizzled down in a steady rhythm that soaked through my worn shirt within seconds. The village stretched around me, a collection of sagging huts and muddy paths that looked even more miserable under the weight of the storm. I made my way toward the edge of the settlement, passing empty vegetable gardens and fire pits that had long gone cold. Other families were suffering just as much as mine, their doors shut tight against the weather and the shame of their empty cooking pots. The local hunters had already taken the best game from the nearby forest, leaving scraps for those of us who lacked their skill and experience. But I knew something they didn't. The river to the east, swollen with rainwater, would draw animals looking for an easy drink despite the downpour. I picked up my pace, ignoring the mud that sucked to my bare feet with each step, and headed toward the tree line where the forest began. The rain lessened as I moved under the canopy of leaves, though fat drops still fell from branches overhead and splattered against my face. My breathing came harder now, the exertion mixing with nervous energy that made my hands shake as I checked the slingshot one more time. I had hunted before in my previous life, but only after it was too late, only after I had already lost everything that mattered. The sound of rushing water reached my ears before I saw the river itself, a brown churning mass that had swelled to twice its normal size. I crouched behind a fallen log covered in moss and slick fungus, peering over the top to scan the muddy bank on the other side. Movement caught my eye: 3 wild rabbits, their gray fur darkened by rain, hopping cautiously toward the water's edge. I slowly reached for a smooth stone in the pouch at my hip, my fingers closing around its cold surface. The rabbits were about 30 paces away, close enough for a good shot if I could keep my hand steady. I fitted the stone into the slingshot's leather pouch, drawing it back with measured tension while my heart threatened to pound out of my chest. A neon blue box suddenly materialized in the air, directly in front of my face, floating there like a window made of pure light. The shock nearly made me release the slingshot too early, and I froze with the leather pulled taut, staring at the glowing text that had appeared from nowhere. Skill progression detected. Hunting. Level 0, Level 1. The box pulsed with a soft blue glow that illuminated the bark of the log in front of me, and I felt a strange warmth spread through my arms like someone had poured hot water into my veins. This was it, the system awakening I had heard whispered about in my previous life, but never experienced myself. My muscles trembled slightly as the energy settled, and I realized my aim had steadied without any conscious effort on my part. The rabbits remained unaware, their pink noses twitching as they bent to lap at the muddy water. I had only seconds before they would scatter, and despite the shock of the glowing interface still hovering at the edge of my vision, I forced myself to focus on the largest rabbit in the center of the group. The system had given me an edge I never had before, a chance to actually succeed where I had failed in my past life. I released the slingshot with a sharp snap that cut through the sound of rain and rushing water. I crouched down by the riverbank and started clearing away the dead leaves and twigs from a flat section of ground. The cold air bit at my fingers, but the thought of hot food pushed me forward. I pulled out the rabbit from my bag and began skinning it with the small knife I always carried in my pocket. The fur came off easier than I expected, revealing pink flesh underneath that would soon fill my empty stomach. I gathered dry sticks from beneath the nearby trees where the morning rain had not reached them completely. My hands worked quickly, stacking the wood into a small pyramid shape that my father had taught me years ago. I struck the flint twice against the steel, sending sparks down into the bundle of dried grass I had placed at the center. A thin line of smoke rose up, followed by a small flame that licked hungrily at the kindling around it. The fire grew stronger as I fed it more twigs, and soon I had a decent blaze crackling in front of me. I skewered the rabbit meat on a green branch I had stripped of its bark and held it over the flames. Fat dripped from the meat and sizzled when it hit the fire, sending up little bursts of steam that carried the smell of cooking food. My mouth watered so much I had to swallow 3 times just to keep myself from drooling like a child. The wind picked up from across the river, making the flames dance sideways and bringing a chill that cut through my thin shirt. I huddled closer to the fire, turning the spit slowly to cook the meat evenly on all sides. The skin began to turn brown and crispy, and I could see the juices bubbling up through tiny cracks in the surface. Every second felt like an hour as hunger gnawed at my insides with sharp teeth that would not let go. Finally, I could not wait any longer and tore off a piece of the meat with my bare hands. The heat burned my fingers, but I stuffed it into my mouth anyway, chewing fast to break down the tough fibers. Warmth spread through my chest and down into my belly, pushing back the cold that had settled into my bones. Energy flowed back into my tired muscles, and I felt my hands stop shaking for the first time since I had woken up that morning. I finished the rest of the rabbit in quick bites, barely stopping to breathe between mouthfuls of hot meat. When I was done, I sat back against a large rock and let the fire warm my face and hands. The system notification that had appeared earlier still glowed faintly at the edge of my vision, reminding me that this was real and not some dream. I was stronger now, fed and ready to continue the hunt that would keep my family from starving another day. After letting the fire die down to embers, I kicked dirt over it until no smoke remained to give away my position. I shouldered my bag and headed back into the forest where the trees grew thick and close together. The ground was softer here, covered in layers of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps as I moved between the trunks. I spotted fresh tracks in the mud near a fallen log, small prints that could only belong to another rabbit. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping any branches that might scare away my prey. The tracks led me to a clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy above and lit up patches of green grass. Movement caught my eye near the base of an old oak tree, and I saw a brown rabbit nibbling on some shoots. My hand went to my slingshot, and I pulled a smooth stone from the pouch at my waist without making a sound. The rabbit's ears twitched, but it did not look up from its meal as I took aim and pulled back the elastic band. I held my breath and released the stone in one smooth motion, watching it fly straight and true through the air. It struck the rabbit in the side with a dull thump, and the animal dropped without even a squeak of protest. Pride swelled in my chest as I walked over to collect my second kill of the day, knowing that my aim was getting better with each shot. But as I bent down to pick up the rabbit, exhaustion crashed over me like a wave hitting the shore. My legs trembled, and I had to brace myself against the tree trunk to keep from falling to my knees. The energy from my meal was already fading, burned up by the effort of tracking and hunting through the cold forest. I stuffed the rabbit into my bag anyway, refusing to give up when my family was counting on me to bring home food. I started back toward the village, following the narrow path that wound between the trees and over small hills. Each step felt heavier than the last, and my breath came out in white clouds that hung in the freezing air. The sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I was not so tired. I just wanted to get home and hand over the rabbits to my mother before I collapsed into my bed. A rustling sound came from behind me, louder than the wind moving through the leaves overhead. I stopped walking and turned around slowly, my hand already reaching for my slingshot, even though I knew it would not be enough. Two wolves emerged from the shadows between the trees, their yellow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Their fur was matted and dirty, and I could see their ribs pressing against their sides from hunger that matched my own. The wolves split apart and began circling me from opposite directions, their paws making no sound on the leaf-covered ground. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through my chest and fall out onto the path. The bag with my catches hung heavy on my shoulder, and I knew the smell of fresh blood was what had drawn these predators to me. I had two choices: run and probably get caught from behind, or stand and fight with nothing but a slingshot and a small knife. I thought of my mother's face, thin and pale from too many days without enough food to eat. I thought of my younger sister who cried herself to sleep because her stomach hurt from being empty all the time. These wolves want to take away the only thing that could help my family survive another week in this harsh place. My fear turned into something harder and sharper, and I planted my feet firmly on the ground without taking my eyes off either animal. "Not today," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected despite the terror racing through my veins. I walked through the village entrance with my sack of rabbits slung over my shoulder, feeling every muscle in my body scream from exhaustion. The weight pulled at my back, but I refused to let it drag me down. Sweat dripped from my forehead and soaked through my shirt, leaving dark patches across the fabric. A few villagers paused in their work to stare at me as I passed, their eyes widening when they spotted the bulging sack. I kept my chin up and my eyes forward, forcing myself to walk steadily despite the burning in my legs. The path to my home felt longer than usual, each step requiring more effort than the last. My boots scraped against the packed dirt, kicking up small clouds of dust that settled on my worn pants. One elderly man, smoking a pipe on his porch, leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in surprise at the size of my haul. I could feel the weight of their gazes following me, measuring whether I had truly become a hunter worth respecting. Pride swelled in my chest, pushing back against the exhaustion that threatened to buckle my knees. I finally reached my front door and shouldered it open, the familiar creak announcing my arrival before I could say a word. The small main room of our home greeted me with its simple wooden furniture and the faint smell of yesterday's porridge. I lowered the sack onto our worn kitchen table, and the rabbits inside shifted with a heavy thud that echoed through the house. My mother appeared from the back room, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw what I had brought home. "Shandonga, is that?" She moved closer, reaching out but not quite touching the sack, as if afraid it might disappear. I untied the rope at the top and pulled it open, revealing 6 fat rabbits nestled inside. Their fur was still soft, their bodies fresh from my successful hunt in the forest. My younger sister rushed in from outside, her bare feet slapping against the floor as she hurried to see what had caused Mother's gasp. The cooking fire in our small hearth still held glowing embers from this morning, ready to be fed and brought back to life. I began pulling supplies from our meager pantry, finding a dented pot and our only good knife that Father had sharpened before he died. My hands moved quickly despite their soreness, motivated by the thought of my family eating well tonight after so many thin meals. The wooden shelves held only basics, some dried beans, a handful of grain, and a clay jar that might contain a pinch of cooking fat. I grabbed the pot and set it near the hearth, already planning how I would prepare the first rabbit. My mother knelt by the fire and began feeding it small sticks, coaxing the embers back into crackling flames. The orange light grew brighter, casting dancing shadows across the walls of our home and warming the cool air. My sister watched me with wide eyes, her stomach probably already rumbling at the thought of roasted meat. I selected the largest rabbit from the sack and laid it on our cutting board, feeling a surge of satisfaction at being able to provide like this. A knock at our door interrupted my focus. 3 quick raps that sounded almost hesitant. My mother rose to answer it while I continued preparing the rabbit, scoring the skin with careful cuts. Liwa stood in the doorway, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her weathered face creased with a tentative smile. She lived 2 houses down and kept a small herb garden that somehow survived even during the worst dry spells. "I saw you come back with game," she said, glancing past my mother to where I worked at the table. "Thought you might want these to make it taste proper." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal fresh herbs, bright green leaves that filled our home with a sharp, earthy scent. My cheeks warmed slightly as I realized how much better they would make our meal, and how I should have thought to ask for them myself. I wiped my hands on my pants and walked over to accept her offering, suddenly aware of how bare our pantry truly was compared to what a feast required. "That would be perfect," I managed to say, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "Would you like to stay and help cook?" Liwa's smile widened as she stepped inside, bringing the herbs to the table and immediately beginning to strip leaves from their stems. Her practiced hands moved 3 times faster than mine would have, showing years of kitchen wisdom I had yet to learn. My mother returned to tending the fire, building it up until flames licked eagerly at the air and heat radiated throughout the room. The collaboration felt natural, like something our village used to do more often before hunger made everyone guard their resources so carefully. I worked alongside Liwa, watching how she rubbed the herbs between her palms to release their oils before sprinkling them over the rabbit meat. The scent of rosemary and something sharper filled my nose, making my mouth water instantly despite my exhaustion. She pointed to a spot where I should make another cut, her finger guiding my knife hand with gentle pressure. My sister dragged a stool closer to watch, her eyes tracking every movement as if memorizing the process for future meals. The fire crackled louder as my mother added a thicker log, the wood popping and sending tiny sparks up toward our roof. I could feel warmth spreading through the room, chasing away the chill that always seemed to cling to our home's corners. Liwa began humming an old cooking song under her breath, something my grandmother used to sing when I was very small. The familiar melody wrapped around us, turning the simple act of preparing food into something that felt almost sacred. I stepped into the village market with the 2 rabbits slung over my shoulder, their fur still warm against my back. The morning sun hung low behind the wooden stalls, casting long shadows across the packed dirt ground where merchants laid out their meager goods. My stomach clenched as I spotted the grain merchant, a thin man named Mbara who always squinted at people like he expected them to steal from him. He stood behind his table, arranging small cloth bags of millet and maize with careful, suspicious movements. I walked toward him, keeping my steps steady even though my heart hammered against my ribs. Mbara looked up when I approached, and his eyes went straight to the rabbits. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. I lifted the rabbits off my shoulder and laid them on his table, watching his expression for any sign of interest. The man picked up one rabbit by its hind legs, examining the meat with the same skeptical squint he gave everything. "These are fresh from this morning," I said, keeping my voice level. "Good meat, no disease, no damage." Mbara grunted and dropped the rabbit back onto the table with a thump that made me wince. He crossed his arms over his chest, his bony fingers tapping against his elbows in a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. 3 other villagers had gathered nearby, pretending to examine dried fish at the next stall while clearly listening to our conversation. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring whether the boy who had been useless for so long could actually close a decent trade. 2 rabbits for how much grain? Mbara asked, but his tone suggested he already thought the answer would disappoint him. "Enough to feed my family for 3 days?" I replied. Maybe 4 bags of your maize. The merchant laughed, a short bark that carried across the market and made the watching villagers smirk. My face heated, but I forced myself to keep looking at him without dropping my gaze. I needed this trade to work, needed to prove that my system and my new abilities meant something real for my family's survival. 2 bags, Mbara countered, already reaching for smaller sacks beneath his table. And that's generous for rabbit meat, when everyone knows they're easy to catch. My jaw tightened because I knew that wasn't true, not anymore with the snow making the forest dangerous and the animals scarce. I glanced down at the rabbits, at the clean kills I'd made with my improved aim and faster reflexes. The system had earned me these, and I wasn't going to let this man cheat my family out of fair exchange. 3 bags, I said. These are good kills, and you know meat is harder to come by now. Mbara's eyes narrowed, but I saw him hesitate. His hand paused over the grain sacks, and I knew I had him thinking about how quickly he could sell rabbit meat to families who hadn't eaten anything but porridge for days. The moment stretched between us while the watching villagers leaned in closer, curious about whether I would back down like I used to. 3 bags, Mbara finally agreed, his voice sharp with reluctance. But only because my wife likes rabbit stew. I exhaled slowly as he counted out 3 cloth bags of maize, each one heavy enough to make a difference for my mother and sisters. When I loaded them into my carrying sack, the weight felt like victory pressing against my shoulders. The merchant took the rabbits without another word, but I caught the slight nod he gave me before I turned away. It wasn't respect exactly, but it wasn't contempt either, and that shift felt almost as valuable as the grain. The walk to the village chief's house took me past familiar huts and familiar faces, most of whom watched me with expressions I couldn't quite read. I adjusted the grain sack on my back, letting them see that I was carrying something real this time. The chief's house stood at the center of the village, its walls made of better wood, and its roof actually complete without gaps that let in rain. I knocked on the door frame, and Chief Katongo's deep voice called for me to enter. Inside, the chief sat on a carved wooden stool near a small fire that filled the room with warmth and the smell of burning acacia wood. He was a broad man with gray streaking through his hair, and his eyes had the sharp awareness of someone who missed nothing in his village. He gestured for me to sit on the mat across from him, and I lowered myself down while setting the grain sack beside me. Shandonga, the chief said, and the way he spoke my name felt different from how it had sounded a week ago. I heard you brought down game in the forest. Yes, chief, I replied. 2 rabbits this morning, and I traded them for grain. Chief Katongo nodded slowly, his gaze moving from my face to the sack and back again. He reached behind his stool and pulled out a smaller bag, which he set on the ground between us with a soft thump. Through the cloth, I could see the shapes of root vegetables. Your success is good for the village, he said. When one hunter proves the forest isn't empty, others feel encouraged to try. I hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that my hunting might affect anyone beyond my own family. The chief leaned forward slightly, his expression serious in the firelight that danced across the walls. Outside, I could hear footsteps passing by the house, slowing down as if people were trying to hear our conversation. The other hunters have been watching you, Chief Katongo continued, some with doubt, some with interest. My throat tightened because I knew exactly which hunters he meant. The ones who had laughed when I came back empty-handed month after month, who had questioned whether I was worth the food my family needed. I could feel the weight of their judgment, even now, pressing against me from outside these walls. I want to keep hunting, I said. My family needs more than 3 bags of maize. The chief smiled, a small expression that softened the hard lines around his mouth. He pushed the bag of root vegetables closer to me, and I realized they were potatoes, the good kind that kept well and filled stomachs properly. My chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude. Take these as well, Chief Katongo said, and know that your place in this village is being rebuilt, one hunt at a time. I picked up the bag of potatoes, feeling their weight add to the grain already on my back. The chief's words echoed in my head as I stood, bowing slightly in respect before turning toward the door. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning chill and painting the village in harsh, clear light. Several villagers stood in small clusters nearby, their conversations stopping when they saw me emerge with more food than I'd entered with. I walked past them without hurrying, letting them see what I carried. My legs wanted to run home immediately to show my mother and sisters that we would eat well tonight. But I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, to show the same calm I'd maintained with the merchant and the chief. The system had given me a second chance at this life, and I was going to make every moment of it count. By the time I reached our hut, my shoulders ached from the weight of the grain and potatoes, but the pain felt good. Real. Earned. I pushed through the doorway to find my mother sitting by the cold fire pit, mending a torn blanket with careful stitches. She looked up when I entered, and her eyes went wide when she saw what I carried. "Shandonga," she breathed, setting down her sewing. "Is that enough for several days?" I said, setting the bags down carefully. The merchant gave me a fair trade, and the chief added potatoes. My youngest sister, Natasha, appeared from the back room, her thin face lighting up when she saw the food. She rushed forward, her small hands reaching for the bags with an eagerness that made my chest ache. I had been failing them for so long, and now I could finally see hope replacing the constant worry in their expressions. "We'll eat well tonight," my mother said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I nodded, watching as she and Natasha began sorting through the grain and potatoes with efficient movements born from years of stretching too little food too far. But even as relief washed through me, I felt the system humming at the edge of my awareness, reminding me that this was only the beginning. 3 bags of maize and some potatoes wouldn't last forever, and the forest still held dangers I hadn't yet faced. My mother looked up at me while measuring out grain for tonight's meal, her expression both grateful and worried. She knew, just as I did, that the deeper parts of the forest called to hunters who wanted real success. The rabbits had been a start, but if I truly wanted to secure my family's future and earn permanent respect in the village, I would need to venture further than the safe outer regions. "The chief mentioned the other hunters are planning an expedition," I said carefully, "into the deeper wilderness where the larger game travels." My mother's hands stilled over the grain. Her face tightened with the fear I'd expected, but underneath it, I saw something else. Understanding, maybe, or resignation that her son had changed into someone who wouldn't be satisfied with small victories. Natasha looked between us, too young to fully grasp the danger, but old enough to sense the tension. "When?" my mother asked quietly. "Soon," I replied. "I need to prepare." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with all the things we didn't say. That the deeper wilderness held predators that could kill a man in seconds. That my new abilities were still untested against real danger. That this second chance at life meant nothing if I didn't push forward, even when fear tried to hold me back. I thought about the system's promise of progression, about how each successful hunt had already made me faster and stronger. But I also remembered the wolf's teeth and how close I'd come to failing that first real test. My mother returned to measuring grain, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate. She would support my decision because she had no choice, because the alternative was watching our family slowly starve through another harsh season. That knowledge settled into my bones like cold water, driving home the reality that my choices affected more than just my own survival. I stepped outside as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep blue. The village stretched out before me, smoke rising from cooking fires and the sounds of evening routines filling the air. Somewhere in this collection of struggling families, other hunters were making their own preparations, checking their weapons, and planning routes through dangerous territory. Soon I would be among them, pushing deeper into the wilderness where my system abilities and my determination would face their real test. The night brought dreams of shadow beasts and glowing eyes watching from between ancient trees, but when dawn broke, I woke with my resolve intact. My muscles ached less than they had in months, another gift from the system's passive enhancements, and I could feel energy thrumming through my limbs as I stretched. The expedition would leave in 3 days, according to the whispers that had circulated through the village after sunset. 3 days to prepare, to sharpen my borrowed spear and gather what supplies I could afford. I spent the first day watching the other hunters. Not obviously, but with careful attention as I moved through the village on small errands. There were 5 men preparing for the deeper wilderness trip, all of them experienced trackers who'd brought back deer and wild boar in better seasons. I recognized Borani, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s who'd once cuffed me on the ear for getting in his way. He was checking his bow strings near the well, testing the tension with practiced pulls. Beside him stood 2 brothers, Mfatso and Chimwemwa, both lean and scarred from previous hunts. They spoke in low voices about routes and camping spots, their hands sketching invisible maps in the air between them. The other 2 hunters I knew less well. One was an older man called Zakomo, his hair more gray than black, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived decades in dangerous places. The last was younger, maybe only a few years older than me, named Chisomo. He had a nervous energy about him, constantly adjusting his gear and glancing toward the forest line as if expecting something to charge out at him. I approached while they were gathered together near the edge of the village, their equipment spread on the ground for final checks. Borani saw me first, and his expression shifted to something between annoyance and grudging acknowledgement. Word of my rabbit hunt and the chief's gift had clearly reached him. "Shandonga," he said, my name flat in his mouth. "You planning to watch us leave, or do you have business here?" I kept my voice steady, meeting his eyes without challenge but without submission either. "I want to join the expedition." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel. Fatso and Chimwemwa exchanged glances, while Chisomo looked me up and down with obvious skepticism. Only old Zakomo's expression remained neutral, weathered face revealing nothing. Borani laughed, but it was a short, harsh sound. "You caught some rabbits, and now you think you're ready for the deep forest? The things that live out there would use your bones for toothpicks." "I know the risks," I said, though my hands wanted to clench into fists. The system pulsed at the edge of my awareness, responding to my rising tension. "But I need more than rabbits to feed my family through the cold season. Same as everyone else." "The boy has a point," Zakomo said, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "His mother and sisters have been struggling. If he's willing to face the danger, we shouldn't stop him just because we remember him as the hunter who couldn't catch shadows." Chimwemwa frowned, crouching beside a coil of rope. "Extra hands could be useful, but only if those hands don't get us all killed. The deeper wilderness isn't forgiving of mistakes." I felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. These men held my immediate future in their decisions, and I could see the calculation in their eyes. Was I worth the risk? Would bringing an untested hunter endanger their own chances of success? "I can carry my share," I said. "I'm faster than I used to be, and my aim has improved. I won't slow you down." Borani stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath. He was testing me, seeing if I'd back away or hold my ground. I stayed where I was, letting him see that whatever weakness I'd shown before had burned away in the desperate months of failure and rebirth. "Fine," he said finally. "You can come. But you follow orders, you carry the heavy packs, and if something attacks, you don't run until we tell you to run." "Understood." "Understood," I replied, and felt something settle in my chest. Fear, yes, but also anticipation. The system seemed to hum with approval, as if acknowledging that I'd taken another step toward whatever purpose it had given me. The next 2 days blurred together in preparation. My mother helped me repair my worn boots, stuffing the gaps with dried grass and binding them with strips of leather sheets saved for emergencies. Natasha watched with wide eyes as I sharpened my spear on the whetstone we'd borrowed from a neighbor, the scraping sound rhythmic and somehow meditative. Each pass of the blade made it keener, more ready for what waited in the shadows between the ancient trees. On the final evening before departure, Chief Katongo summoned all the hunters to his house. We stood in the firelight while he performed the traditional blessing, burning herbs that filled the room with sharp, cleansing smoke. His words were old ones, passed down through generations, asking the ancestors to guide our paths and steady our hands. I felt the weight of ritual settle over my shoulders like a familiar cloak, connecting me to every hunter who'd ever ventured into dangerous territory seeking food for their people. To be continued.